All right. Um, just making sure everything's working with the live stream here. Thank you for everybody that is joining us. I'm going to turn off my music here. I don't know if there is anybody on the stream. I'm going to try to get used to streaming here somewhat regularly, talking about especially the things that I'm studying as I'm studying religion and trying to work together to kind of make a book on world religions these days. And so that's got a lot of work in front of me for that project. But I really hope to be sharing what I'm learning with you guys as I kind of go along with that process. A lot of what I'm trying to do as I kind of create this is create something that ends up being basically a resource for people on the very basics of what religion teaches and what it's about. I realize that it can be so confusing to know how to navigate, how to talk about what exactly each religion really is talking about, what it's about, what the basics of it are, anything like that. And so I'm just trying to create a resource. My hope is to create a resource through a book and through my YouTube channel to simplify all of that. And so I've kind of tried to break down, or I'm attempting to try to break down all of the world's religions into basically their views on 8 issues, giving a quick synopsis of what that religion, how it kind of came about historically and otherwise, and then talk about their scriptures, basically what they believe from those, and then the 8 categories that I think end up really defining every religion, particularly from another one, is these views of heaven, hell, nature of God, nature of man, sin, salvation, and the fall. And I think every religion can pretty much be broken up into these. And it also clarifies a lot of things. For instance, I, as a Christian, and most Christians wouldn't actually look at Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons as Christians. Now, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, are going to object to that. But I think the reasons, once you've actually studied world religions and you see how very different what I would call liturgical or Protestant Christianity, liturgical meaning Orthodox or Catholic, and then Protestant, which kind of gets away from liturgical but still agrees on maybe a broader sense would be Orthodox Christianity, not meaning the Orthodox Church, but creedal Christianity maybe is a better term to start using. That Mormonism is so vastly different. Jehovah's Witness is so vastly different from what's been historical Christianity and what I would call creedal Christianity, Protestant, Catholics, and Orthodox. That it really becomes hard pill to swallow that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses are really Christian. So looking at these 8 things, you can actually see that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses probably actually share less in common with Christians than Christians do with Muslims. And if that's true, man, it's really hard pill to swallow that to kind of make the point that Mormons are still Christians. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. If you guys have questions that you want to throw out during this, if you join in, feel free to ask questions, and I will try to get to those as we go through this stream. So with that, I'm going to get into today's content. We're talking about Scientology. This is a topic that probably more than anything else, there is rabbit trails to get into. Scientology, obviously, we know all of the ways that it's viewed as this kind of celebrity religion or celebrity cult, and different things like that. And so somebody's knocking on my door. Give me 1 second. All right. Sorry for that. So with that, there's all sorts of rabbit trails that we can kind of get into, all sorts of different things that I could talk about. But I want to, again, stick with kind of those basic things. So I realize I've said these 8 basic things, but I haven't explained what those are. So those 8 things are heaven, nature of God, nature of man, hell, sin, salvation, and the fall. And I think pretty much every religion we look at has a view of these, and they might not use those terms. And in some ways, it might be a stretch to call it heaven. For instance, when we talk about Hinduism, calling it heaven is a little odd because you're really reincarnating and kind of moving up in the ladder, and eventually maybe you attain this nirvana-like state. But that doesn't necessarily mean you've kind of gone on to a new life in the same way you might think of it as a Christian. And so these terms, I understand that don't transfer perfectly to every religion. It's not like we're talking about the pantheon of the Greek gods versus the pantheon of the Nordic gods, where that term pantheon transfers really, really well. These end up being a little bit more ambiguous. But with that in mind, we're going to get into Scientology. We're going to break down those things. We're going to talk about the history. So here we go. First of all, Scientology. Let me click here. Was started by a guy named L. Ron Hubbard. This is Hubbard. This is the guy. And when you watch, generally when I give a presentation of this, I might end up giving a whole explanation of kind of some of the things that he's claimed to have done, and watching the video from the Church of Scientology, kind of even talking about who he is and what he's about. But doing this on YouTube, I realize, especially with the Church of Scientology, if I play you guys a video from what he or what the Church of Scientology says he's about and what he's done, I will get slammed with a copyright infringement, and my video will be taken down, or at least that part of it will be muted. And so for the sake of just keeping this a little bit more professional, I'm not going to be showing you guys the video, but I will provide links in the description for you guys to watch those videos to kind of talk about it. If you watch this first video that kind of talks about who L. Ron Hubbard is, you'll find out essentially the history of him is that he has all of these different claims about him. One is going to be that he was the youngest Boy Scout ever, and that he then even presents the Boy Scouts of America to the president and kind of ends up being the representative of Boy Scouts to the United States president. Now, being an Eagle Scout, what's interesting in that is when you look at the records of the Boy Scouts, they don't actually keep track of who the youngest is. They keep track of who got it when. They don't necessarily keep track of birth dates and things like that. So the claim that he was the youngest Boy Scout ever, there's even a letter from Boy Scouts of America when someone inquired from them, is this really true? They basically replied back, we have no way of really knowing because we didn't keep track and records of how young Boy Scouts were when they became an Eagle Scout. So that's one of the claims that comes out. They talk about him being a pilot and kind of being a pioneer in that. And then he also gets his Master Mariner's license. And the claim in that even ends up being that he then has the ability to navigate any ship in any waters because he's got this license to do so. It's a very bold claim. And though you might be licensed to captain any ship by having that license, it doesn't mean you can just captain any ship. And you'll see that when we kind of examine his naval history. After he had done a lot of sailing, then he went and attended George Washington University and is believed to have studied nuclear physics while he was there. We'll examine that as well. So this whole video that they first give to kind of present, here's L. Ron Hubbard, here's the guy who founded it, is very boisterous. It's very, you kind of finish the video and you're like, wow, what an amazing guy. And that's of course what they're trying to stir up with it. And it's hard not to like finish that video and be like, wow, this is just an amazing guy. Look at all of the things he accomplished. He was a pilot. He was a master mariner. He joined the Navy, and he was a commander of multiple corvette ships, and all of these different things that he did. And then he was wounded in the Navy, and then was supposedly supposed to be bedridden for the rest of his life, and then kind of figured out this thing called Dianetics. And Dianetics is really what ends up being the center of Scientology. And through Dianetics, you kind of unlock, in a sense, and we'll explain this more in depth, you unlock part of your brain in order to be able to heal yourself and bring about self-healing, because you are unlocking the fact that you are, in fact, a spirit being. And I'll explain more of that later, but right now I'm just kind of talking very basics of who Hubbard is. And then after he did that in the Navy, after he got his Purple Heart and was wounded, he was able to heal himself through Dianetics and was able to help other people heal themselves through Dianetics. And then eventually that turns into something that he is promoting as a psychological science in order to fix things with your body psychologically, because that's really what you're doing. And then through that, what is claimed is then the psychological world looked down on it poorly because they're trying to kind of protect their own power and that sort of thing. And so then he creates it, then bringing it into a religion so they can't persecute those who are wanting to do Scientology, and it becomes a religion. So that's the very basics of it. That's how Scientology gets its start, is with this guy, L. Ron Hubbard, coming up with all of these things. And he ends up writing this whole book. And I have a copy of it. I'll show you guys. This is probably one of the few parts of material that you can get that is produced by the Church of Scientology that's pretty easy to get your hands on. The other things that they have a lot of times are really hard to find. And that's something that we'll talk about as well, is some of the weirdness when it comes to the Church of Scientology is the way in which they seem to be just making boatloads of money in the things that they're publishing. And you would expect a church that wants to help people would be just giving this stuff away as Christians. For instance, I even just went on a website, livingwaters.org, and told them, hey, we would love to get these copies. They have these little Gospel of John. And you can go onto their website. You can just request some of them. Maybe they'll send you one, or if you say that you're doing this for evangelism, they'll send you a box or two. Because, hey, this is good news. We want people to know about it. I don't want to charge you for it. I want to help people. That's the goal. But with Dianetics and with Scientology, it becomes much more of a money grab, and it should be one of those first red flags that you end up kind of seeing with all of this. So this is the book. This is Dianetics. This is the first kind of start to all of it that everything kind of is based around. This is something that's easy to get a hold of. I ordered mine off of Amazon. I think I got it for about $12. So that one's easy to get a hold of. But anything beyond that becomes really difficult to get a hold of. So moving on here, like I said, I'm not going to show, unfortunately, you guys the videos that I usually would show to people as I'm doing this presentation, just because, unfortunately, I think if I did, I would get slammed with some copyright infringements. And Scientology, the Church of Scientology, would probably at least get that part of the video muted. And I just don't see that being worth showing you guys. So with that in mind, first I want to talk about his education. So one of the claims in that first video, that again, I'll have the link for in the description below, is that he went to George Washington University and he became a nuclear physicist during that. And you know, it's also weird in the video, some of the things, it's just so outrageous, the claims that the video makes. It'll talk about he studied nuclear physics and engineering, and through that, the claim ends up being is by studying that stuff, he gained the knowledge and understanding to examine human thinking, by studying physics and engineering, he somehow came to understand human thinking. Like, it's honestly hard to watch the video without just kind of laughing a little bit at some of the outrageous claims that it makes. So the claim that he studied nuclear physics, I'm going to show you guys here. This is his transcript from George Washington University. And what's interesting, it says that he studied nuclear physics there, but if you actually look at his transcript here, you can see that it says he's actually a candidate for the degree of Sciences and Civil Engineering, conditioned in chemistry for 1 unit, condition removed by work in college. So in other words, he didn't attend this university to study physics, as the Church of Scientology likes to claim. He wasn't attending there for a physics degree. He was attending that university for an engineering degree. Now then, if you look even closer and you look at what did he specifically get classes in, and you look, these are all the classes that he took. He took maybe a semester's worth, 15 and a half credits. I took that much in one semester. He took total of 15 and a half credits through that whole time. And as far as studying nuclear physics, well, again, if you look at his transcript here, he had one class in modern physical phenomenon, molecular and atomic physics. One class. He didn't study nuclear physics there. And the claim also is that George Washington University is one of the first universities to study nuclear physics. I'll admit I haven't studied this, but I kind of have my doubts that Yale or Princeton or Harvard or Oxford or an engineering school like one of the mine schools didn't get around to studying nuclear physics before George Washington University. I just have my doubts. All of that to be said, when you look at his transcript for this class, the one class that he did on nuclear physics, if that's even really fair to call it that, because it's really called molecular and atomic physics, he failed that class. He got an F. In fact, when you read later down in the transcript, it says he was actually suspended because he wasn't doing well academically. So the claim, again in the video, the video will end up making the claim that not only did he do that, he was studying that, and then it got interrupted by a war. He was studying all of these different things, and then he also somehow found the thing that unites all pieces of life. And they don't really explain much of what that was. They kind of just mention offhand this paper that's supposed to have put that information together for us to learn and study, even though that document doesn't seem to be something that ends up being that important to Scientology as a whole, nor did it ever seem to get published in any sort of scientific journal. But that seems to be, in a lot of ways, what they claim ends up being the foundation for a lot of what Scientology ends up getting into. But all of that gets interrupted as he's studying nuclear physics at George Washington University, one of the first universities to study nuclear physics, by World War II. And there he is claimed to have, again, he got his Master Mariner's license. Now, I couldn't find any document that seemed to prove that he even had that sort of license. They showed a video, a document that seemed to go across just in the graphics that showed that, but I couldn't find any actual physical like PDF or anything that showed that he actually had a Master Mariner's license. I'm not saying that necessarily he didn't have it, but I haven't seen any plain evidence of such. That being said, the claim that they then make with that is then he has the ability to navigate any and every vessel on any ocean anytime. That's just simply not how the military works. And so when we start to examine, all right, well, let's look at his naval career according to what the military has actually told us regarding it. The claim that the Church of Scientology makes is that he actually kind of had control of a whole fleet of, this is called a corvette. It's a ship that was specifically made to go after submarine vessels. It was a type of destroyer, and it was one of the better ships in some ways, one of the smaller ships of the Navy, but one of the nicer ships of the Navy, especially for going after submarines. So their claim is that that's what he had control over. Of course, though, he could have done anything much more sophisticated, much bigger. He could have been in charge of a carrier. He could have, because he had his Master Mariner's license, so he could have piloted any of these type of ships or commanded and captained any of these type of ships. That's the claim. But when then we actually examine, okay, well, what boats did he actually captain? Well, the two that he actually captained are these two. And the first is the USS YP-422, which essentially was a jerry-rigged fishing trawler that was released from duty it's a fishing trawler. It wasn't made for the Navy. It was not a Navy ship, but when the war started, they needed some ships to even just kind of keep track of what's in the yard, what's in the shipyard, and kind of almost be like little security boat. And that's what this was. YP, you know that's kind of what that's representing. It's not a ship that's going to go to war by any means. But he was removed from duty of that ship within a month. And the command from the Boston shipyard that he was at basically said, we see him as temporarily not fitted for independent command. So he has command of this ship for 30 days and then he's removed from command because he's seen as not fit for command. Now, somehow or another, he still ends up getting command of another vessel, a bigger vessel called the USS PC-815 that was a submarine chaser. So in some ways similar to these corvettes, but you can see just looking at the size difference, clearly one of these is much more sophisticated, modern, and just a better vessel. So it's not nearly the level of importance that the Church of Scientology is wanting to put on that vessel. And when we then examine looking at these, so if we were to actually look up all of these, just these PC-815 style boats, and I'm forgetting the name of that style, there was actually only 3 submarines that were ever sunk by any vessel of that type. And they were all sunk not in the Pacific Ocean, taking out Japanese submarines, as was claimed according to the Church of Scientology, or what Charles Taze Russell said, but they were all actually that they took out U-boats in the Atlantic that were German. They were not they were not Japanese submarines. Not to mention, the only submarines that were ever seen and sunk in the Pacific Ocean of Japanese vessels were not even sunk in the area that Ron Hubbard claims that he sunk this submarine. So that also doesn't make any sense. It's just not adding up. There's ways that we can already see that he's clearly making stuff up. It's a story. It's not true. One of the more interesting claims that he makes, and maybe one of the more reasonable actually claims, is that he wrote a ton. So here's an example. When you look at his books, these are all books that he wrote. And he is actually, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, today viewed as the most published author of all of history. So according to the Guinness Book of World Records, he's published by one author. He's published 1,084 books. And the last was published in March 2006. From February 1934 till March 2006, he published over 1,000 books. Now, here's where this gets weird, because some of this I would say Guinness needs to do a little bit more research on their information. I'm not at all saying that he wasn't a prolific writer, but he died in 1986. So if he's still publishing books in 2006, that's 30 years after his death. Now, I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan. I've read a lot of his books, and I've even read the Silent Planet series has actually one book called The Dark Tower that was published after C.S. Lewis died. He's got a number of things, essays mainly, and even The Dark Tower in that series is an incomplete book. He has a number of books that are published after his death. And that's not uncommon for really well-known authors, which he was. But to have that many books published after his death becomes a bit suspicious. In fact, when you look at the dates, he died January 1986. And in 1986, he died in January of 1986. And in 1986, that same year he died, in the first month of that year he died, 10 of his books were published. 10 books. And then since then, there's still been books that are published for another 30 years after that. Something about that just isn't adding up. Now, probably one of the most interesting quotes to all of Scientology and what L. Ron Hubbard said while he was on Earth, considering what movement he started, is he actually said about writing, he said this: to make $1 million, the way to make $1 million is to start a religion. Now, if I knew an author who had published this many fantasy stories, and again, the claim with the Church of Scientology is that he wrote all of these books based upon the experiences and the things that he did, all of these adventures that he did while he was a captain, and he traveled all over the world, which seems like he did do a lot of traveling. Or he even had access to these forbidden texts, Buddhist texts at one point, which why he got permission to these and other people didn't. Again, it just puts things into question. But all of these stories, these fictional stories that he come up with, apparently are supposed to just be stories that he just kind of expounded on his actual experiences and what he did. And he's kind of making this Indiana Jones type characters that's hard to believe. And then he goes along and says, if you're going to make $1 million, the easiest way to do it is to make up a religion. If I had somebody like that I knew was a masterful writer, fascinating books, he's obviously very well read. I've talked with people who read his books of fiction before they understood that he was the founder of Scientology. So he's a good writer. And then he somehow makes up this religion. If someone's really good at making up stories, they're probably going to be very good at making up something that sounds like it's true that's really not, because they know what grabs you. They know what gets your attention. And so this should put up red flags for us when he says something as bold and as crazy as that. All right, so getting into a little bit of their beliefs, I'm going to give some things that aren't necessarily breaking down those 8 things, but are some of the things that a Scientologist would tell you are central. And one of those things is looking at what they call the 8 dynamics. Now, again, I would love to show you the video of this, but instead what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you kind of a picture of it, and I'll put the description of the video into the description here. And so you can check it out for yourself and watch it. But I can basically explain to you in this video, he breaks down all of these views of what is called the 8 dynamics, which are essentially 8 ways in which your life needs to get balanced. And these are concentric circles. So you can see here in this video, it's showing 1, 2, 3, and they're circles that slowly get bigger, and they encapsulate the circle before them. So first you start with, you have to get yourself on track, yourself. So the first dynamic is self, and how they describe it. And I'll just say exactly how they have it on their website and then their video. It says, it's the effort to survive as an individual and to be an individual. It is an effort to survive in the highest level for the longest amount of time. It includes immediate possessions and does not include other people. So this is that I see I'm in danger, I'm going to save myself. I see that if I do this, I will live a nicer life. I'm going to focus on myself. The next one ends up being what they call creativity. And this one's hilarious to me because I guess they wanted to be ironically creative with the title, and so they called it creativity. But as it's described, it says making things for the future and any creation. This includes the family unit, raising children, family activity, including sex as a mechanism for future survival. So in other words, family. That's what this is. I don't know why they felt like they need to reinvent that word, but instead they say this is the creative dynamic. It's the family dynamic, because that's all of what it's talking about and describing. And then creativity is creation, even though those are two very different things. And that's what you'll find with so many religions. What they end up doing is they take a word that has one meaning and kind of twisting it to mean something a little bit different what that word actually means. So the next dynamic is group survival. The urge to survive through a group or as a group. This can be a community, friends at work, a state, or nation, race, or any group, no matter the size, seeking to survive as a group. Now, this is what's funny about this, is because they want to say that these are like these clear-cut circles, but what you realize as they describe each one is there's like ton of overlap, to act as if like, well, you have the self, and then outside of that's your family. That kind of makes sense. But then when you start saying, well, it could be a nation, it could be a state, it could be race, it could be just your friends. Well, like, which one? Do I have to choose one group survival that I'm a part of, or am I a part of all of them? And how do those overlap with each other? It just starts getting complicated and doesn't make a lot of sense. Species is another one. It's the urge towards survival through all mankind and is all mankind. So now we're going outside of that group, your race, your state, your nation, all of mankind surviving together. Next is life forms. Life forms is the urge to survive as life forms with the help of life forms such as animals, birds, insects, fish, vegetation, and anything motivated by life. So this is now anything that's alive. Life forms, that one makes sense. The next one's spiritual, and this is the urge to survive as spiritual beings and the urge for life itself to survive. Anything spiritual, identified or not, fits under this heading. So, everything. But it's not everything, because the next one's everything. The last one is infinity, also known as God, or the supreme being, but correctly understood as infinity. And this is where Scientology starts to say some things where it's like, oh, that sounds really sophisticated. That sounds really smart. But when you just think about it for a moment, you're like, no, that's not sophisticated and smart. That's just gibberish. You just said something that doesn't make sense and passed it off as some like aged wisdom or something. So infinity, to define the whole thing, is also known as God, or the supreme being, but correctly understood as infinity. Infinity embraces the allness of all. What? What are you talking about? The allness of all. That's nonsense. You're not saying anything at that point. That has no actual meaning to it. What's the allness of all? The blueness of blue, the redness of red, the coldness of cold. You haven't told me what it is. And so it ends up being this kind of gibberish. So let's get down to just the very basics. Going back to, as L. Ron Hubbard discovers this understanding of, if I can kind of unlock my mind in a sense, I can bring healing to myself. How is that working? And that's what we call Dianetics. So Dianetics is this view that essentially you have your analytical mind, which is you thinking logically, you thinking clearly, and you have your reactive mind. And your reactive mind is a result of impressions from previous lives. So they believe in a level of reincarnation, and you having bad experiences from previous lives or experiences from this life, clouding out who you actually are. And who you actually are is what they call a thetan, which a thetan is just a spiritual being. So your reactive mind clouds your ability to use your analytical mind to think clearly in your analytical mind. So the reactive mind then doesn't think reasonably, and it contains all the pains and the bad experiences that you've ever happened to you in the past in exact detail. Now, there is something to be said for some truth in this. Part of what they're kind of getting at is kind of where sometimes a phobia might come from you. So if I got bit by a brown recluse as a child, I probably am going to have some level that I am scared of spiders. But that might go beyond what is logical, because if I start running away from a daddy long leg, that doesn't make sense. It's not something that ever is going to hurt me. But I had an experience with a brown recluse that was bad, and it's right for me to be afraid of a brown recluse. What this would be saying, what Dianetics would be in turn saying, is your reactive mind is what is getting you to not think analogically, not think logically about these things. And so that's why you have to get rid of your reactive mind. So the thoughts in our reactive mind affect our thoughts, our actions, and our physical well-being. So not only is it that you're going to have a phobia, but like your depression, your physical ailment that you're dealing with, your sickness, your inability to work properly or be successful is because your reactive mind, your experiences of this life or the past life, have affected you in a way that you can't perform. And that's why you need it fixed. So all your negative actions and experiences then are the result of your reactive mind. And what Dianetics does then is it offers, through auditing, one is able to break the bonds of the reactive mind, and this is called going clear. When you're clear, you've gotten rid of your reactive mind, you're able to think clearly about things and no longer dealing with your reactive mind anymore. So how does auditing work? This is what we end up hearing about with so much money going into the Church of Scientology, and how they end up ruining people. Literally financially crippling people for life because of the ways that they force people to take these things, thinking that I'm not successful, I'm depressed, I'm whatever, because of this reactive mind, and Dianetics can help. So this is what they end up claiming. Auditing is basically this e-meter is what it's called. And this e-meter essentially looks like a lie detector test, but instead of having the normal strap around your chest with a little thing attached to your thumb to really kind of measure your pulse and your blood pressure to see if you're kind of getting tense in the moment, you hold on to these little, they look like hollowed out cans. And those are attached then to this auditing machine. And it's funny, you could kind of guess this almost just looking at it, that maybe this is how it works. But when I went, if you are interested, you can go to the Church of Scientology. You can actually take this little, and we'll talk about it, a personality test, kind of get their results. And they might even give you, if you ask, a chance to look at one of these auditing things and kind of see how it works. So we did this as a club for Ratio Christi at Colorado State, where I run the chapter. And one of my students went up, and I could kind of tell, I think maybe he's squeezing it a little bit, but my other student was not so subtle about it. So she walks up to it. She literally just looks me in the eye, and she's holding it. And you look at her and you can just see that she just squeezes those two cans as hard as she can. And the needle on that meteor just shot up. And of course the guy's like, well, you can't do that. You have to just relax, because that's not how this works. But essentially what is happening is they will just take you into these auditing classes. And what they are trying to do is they will interview you for however long it may take. It might be that you're in there for 30 minutes. It might be that you're in there with them for a couple of hours, and they're just going to ask you all sorts of different questions. And of course, eventually when you maybe get asked a question about something that is hard from your past or whatever else, then you're going to tense up. And what do we do when we're tense? We just naturally kind of squeeze things. That's why we have stress balls, right? Because there's something about grabbing onto something and squeezing it like that kind of stresses you out, and it helps you release that stress. So they'll take you into this and they'll ask you those questions. And then when they see a reaction because you're squeezing the cans, then they've said, we've found your ruin. And they might keep asking questions to find several different things that they call your ruin. But essentially what your ruin is your ruin is the thing that is holding you back, the thing within your reactive mind that you are bothered by, that is holding you back from being successful, that is responsible for your depression, that's responsible for your sickness, that's responsible for whatever it may be. That's what the auditing is end up doing. It's finding your ruin, and then they'll say, hey, but here's the good news. You have that ruin. It's holding you back. We can fix it with a class. And that's what we get into after that. So the auditing up to that point could be free. So it's may not even cost you anything. You do this personality test, you do that, it's free, and then you're kind of in the clear to start moving through the classes. But then they start charging you for things. So auditing and going through trainings help you to move up the bridge to a point of finally becoming clear. So what's the bridge? This is the bridge. You start down here at the very bottom. Let me move my little video there. You start down here at the very bottom, and as you go through auditing, they're going to recommend different classes for you to take. And when you've done well enough in that class, then you can go up in the next class. But those classes, believe it or not, cost money. And as you move up, eventually you get to the point that you're clear, and this is what L. Ron Hubbard supposedly reached, a point at which then he could completely heal himself, even though he died in 1986, I think, of a heart attack. You're supposed to be able to move forward. Now, this was the first version of the bridge. This is how basic it was at first, but it's gotten more complicated. First, it started like that. Then it was this, quite more in depth. Then it was this. And now this is it. And now they've renamed it to the Bridge of Total Freedom, kind of making it sound a little bit more palatable. So this is what Scientology really ends up being about, is going through all of this auditing to fix yourself, to get rid of the ways that you have wrong thinking in your life, and going through auditing that is going to help fix that. So now let's talk a little bit about those 8 things that kind of break down religions again. So the first in all of this is what we call the nature of man. So nature of God, nature of man. And according to Scientology, the nature of God is expressed, as I mentioned before, as the 8th dynamic, or the urge towards existence as infinity, or the allness of all, as they also like to put it. So it doesn't really tell you anything. It sounds smart, but really it's not really saying anything. As far as man then is concerned, they would say man is a spiritual being, a thetan. This means that a man is non-material and immortal and possesses unlimited powers and potentials. Thetans, which were once trapped in the material world and lost knowledge of their being. So, in other words, we are spiritual beings, but then we got trapped within this material existence, and through that we lost knowledge of who we are as spiritual beings. And Scientology, what Scientology does is it helps bring the remembrance that the Thetan already knows that they are a spiritual being, and awareness of your divineness to be able to go even to over the border of life and death, which is what then they claim happened with L. Ron Hubbard. He just decided I've had enough with this life. Even though I could heal myself, I'm just going to move on. Humans have a mind, they have a body, and they are Thetan. And in the end, man is basically good. This is the premise then that all of Scientology kind of gets built upon. So I break it down like this because what's interesting is when you start talking with someone who is a Scientologist, we had somebody last year come to our chapter who was a Scientologist, but she would also say, I'm a Christian Scientologist. But when you look at the ways that it's expressing who you are, it's defining both God differently and man differently. And I think what ultimately is the reason for that is, like any good cult, they don't tell you everything when you get into it. And it's not until you get further in that you start to see this doesn't add up, or it goes against some of my other beliefs. But they're hoping that now your dedication is more towards Scientology than towards the religion that you previously were. And you'll follow with that. So these are the reasons. Again, this is why I like to break it down by looking at these 8 things, because I think it starts to give a very clear-cut view of how these things are off. So the next part is creation. So creation, the theta, or the life force, has created matter, energy, space, and time, also known as MEST, M-E-S-T, matter, energy, space, time. The theta, along with MEST, combined to form all living beings. So there's some level that what Scientology is actually promoting is this view that everything is God, that all of us are God, one singular being as God. And then death, as opposed to creation, is seen as when your spirit becomes disconnected from your body. Now, obviously, this starts to point out the ways that we see things differently. We are not simply God and material put together. God created us. We are created beings. We are not God. We will not be God. We cannot reconcile with Scientology. You cannot be Scientologist and a Christian at the same time. It doesn't work. So the fallen sin then is composed of the lies and hidden actions, and to be rightly defined is untruth. So sin could be in some ways the ways that you have said or done things to others that have affected them to mess up their analytical mind and give them a reactive mind, or the ways that you've maybe even done some things to yourself, or in general, even the way that you just aren't thinking clearly. In fact, you could kind of steal from this kind of an idea from the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith kind of talks about how we've in some sense forgotten who we are, or we've forgotten who God is. And so it's like looking at a mirror or looking through a glass. And in order to understand things, we have to clean that mirror. And that's what Scientology is proposing to do. And that clearness, the dirtiness of the mirror or the window is the reactive mind that is the sin that is keeping you from seeing the truth. The fall then is the traumatic experiences of both this life and the previous lives, rebirths, and are impediment to the rational behavior and spiritual development. They call this aberrated. So we'll just kind of keep moving on. The next part, and I'll explain a little bit here in this, you're seeing this person who's dressed up in naval garb, and they are part of what's called the Sea Org, which we'll talk about in a minute here. But then now there are views of heaven, hell, and salvation. Heaven then is the idea of heaven really doesn't exist in Scientology. But as a goal, Scientology is trying to rid yourself of the false ideas, the reactive mind, from the past lives and coming to know your true self. And so in a sense, by freeing yourself of the reactive mind, it's not that you go to a place that is heaven, but you have achieved knowledge of heaven and who you are. And so in a sense, you're in heaven. And then your job is to help others do the same, that in the end, you can bring heaven back in a sense, which is something that I can actually look at and say, hey, that's actually something might be a way that you can talk with a Scientologist and say, hey, this is actually something that I kind of agree with you about. Because part of what our view is as Christians is that we're not just simply supposed to sit here and wait for Christ to come back and fix everything. In a sense, we are, because we know in the end, that's the only thing. That's the only way that things will be put right, that justice will be served and everything will be back to the way that it should be. But we also look at it in another sense of you and I, as children of God and as co-heirs with Christ, are then supposed to bring a taste of heaven on earth here. Because the kingdom of God is now. In a sense, we're not just waiting for it. And so this is where we can say, hey, let's talk about a similarity here. Not to say that we're agreeing with Scientology, but to say, I think there is a little bit of a nugget of truth that you have here that has just been twisted, which just shows once again all of the ways that a religion just ends up twisting what is the truth. So getting back to it, hell then is an opposite. As an opposite, hell is simply living in ignorance of your past. It's an effect on your reactive mind and your inability to overcome your ruin. So as salvation, what Scientology does is Scientology auditing frees the thetan, the reactive mind, from the reactive mind, and the loss of rational behavior and spiritual development that has occurred from this and previous rebirths. Full salvation results in a godlike status of a full operating thetan, OT. If we went back to the bridge, we could see here, let me go back really quick. You can see at the top is OT. So that's what you're actually reaching for, is to become an operating thetan, freeing them from all limitations of this life. Auditing also helps one find their actual original identity. So you've forgotten who you are. Along with individual salvation, Scientology also works for global salvation, cleaning the planet of irrationality, criminality, and wars. These are things that I'm pretty much literally getting word for word from their website. So how to kind of get involved, some other things that I want to leave you guys with in this. If you want to try to have a dialogue with the Scientologist, one of the best ways that you can do it is you can sign up to do their personality test. It is pretty interesting. I don't think there's probably a lot of scientific data behind it, but it was something that all of us as a club, we went down, we got our results, we talked about them afterwards, and we were even pointing out, hey, there were some things that I think it pointed out some of this guy's personality correctly, or this one's a little off, or just as any personality test I think I've done seems to have some things that are spot on and some things that seem a little off. But I did want to share with you, as I took that personality test, there was just some hilarious questions that I just couldn't help but laugh from, that I just have to share with you guys. So here's a few of them real quick. So question number 1, is your voice monotonous rather than varied in pitch? That was literally one of the questions. I don't know what they're trying to reveal from that, just based upon how you're talking. Maybe they're saying, well, if you're monotonous all the time and you're talking like Eeyore, you must be depressed, and then we can find your ruin with that and we can help you solve that. I don't know. Maybe that's what they were getting at. I'm not sure. Do you speak slowly? Maybe you're not smart, and so that would be your ruin and you need to think faster. Does an unexpected action cause your muscles to twitch? Again, I think this one's probably hinting at an idea that something's physically wrong with you. And of course, Dianetics can help you with that. Do you consider there are other people who are definitely unfriendly toward you and work against you? So do you think that you have enemies? Is there somebody after you? Can we help with that? Or are you just, paranoid, and we can help you with that too? Do you find yourself being extra active for periods lasting several days? Do you not know how to slow down? We can help you with that. Could you agree to strict discipline? Now, this one scares me because we're going to talk about a little bit some of the things that they do with kids, even with the schools that have either been shut down or even still around, and some of the ways that they do discipline within those who are part of the Sea Org, which is essentially they're kind of like priests or ministers. There's probably a better way of putting that. Staff is actually probably a more appropriate way of saying it. But some of the ways that they handle that, that's a scary question to have on this. Do you often sing or whistle just for the fun of it? I don't know if that's like a bad thing or if they're like, well, if they don't like to sing or whistle, then something's wrong with them. I have no idea. But like I said, these are just some of the questions that I thought were hilarious. Is your life a constant struggle for survival? Now, this was something that I skipped over a little bit. Part of what Dianetics and the whole Scientology claim is that life is just a struggle for survival, which, you know, if you go back to those 8 stages or 8 rings, I'm forgetting now what they called them. Each of those are looking at it of like, all right, survival for self, survival for your family, for survival for your group, survival for mankind as a whole, survival for all of living beings and things. It's all about survival. That's what Scientology is supposed to be all about. Are you concerned about the need to protect your health? I mean, there's a certain amount that everyone should be. Maybe they're again trying to point out the people that are maybe a little overly concerned about this, but it seems like there's a healthy amount. Are you happy unless you have are you rarely happy unless you have a special reason? Again, I think kind of getting at, are you depressed? We can help you with that. Would you admit you were wrong just to keep the peace? This, I think, is, again, kind of similar to that question of, could you agree to strict discipline? I think there's a level that some of these questions are honestly like grooming of like, hey, can we brainwash this person easily? Because there is like some crazy surveys out there that they will actually do these tests. They will get a group of people to volunteer, and they will kind of have them fill out some math questions or whatever. And it'll be something like, what is 7 plus 3? And they get all of these placed people to say that 7 plus 3 is 12, and see if the one person that they're actually testing, will he agree just because he doesn't want to ruffle feathers? Are you willing to admit you're wrong just to keep the peace? And it is fascinating. The majority of people, even with something like that, will actually be willing to say they're wrong or go along with, 7 plus 3 is 12. And if you can find people that are willing to do that, it's a lot easier to get them into a cult. Do you consider modern prisons, the modern prisons without bars system, doomed to failure? That one, I'm like, that's very political. Really interesting to me that they would kind of ask that. This one is another scary one. Would you buy on credit with the hope that you can keep up with the payments? We'll talk about this in a minute, but with, or we'll even get into it now. With moving up and going through the auditing and the courses that they recommend, generally to move from one stage of that bridge to the next, it generally costs in today's money, today's money, it's still going on. Generally to move up, it's going to cost from one stage to the next about 20 grand, which then the reason why they ask that is because some of the people that end up going around trying to find people to do the auditing and start getting into the program, they will, once you've gotten a little bit into it, and we're going to start recommending classes to you, they have looked up your credit score. They have figured out how much money you have in savings. They figured out how much money you're making in your job. They're figuring out how much can we ask for this person to pay for this class to make as much money as we can for the church. It's not about, can we make this as affordable as possible for this person? And we're seeing that this person's struggling financially, so we're going to make it free for them, or we're going to make it really inexpensive. No, they are looking to get every nickel and dime out of you as they possibly can. They're trained to do so. As you might guess, there's some videos from Leah Remini, who is one that has left. She was an actress on King of Queens, and she left Scientology, and she's done a whole bunch of videos, a whole documentary series. I think they have 3 seasons now, exposing a lot of the horrendous things that the Church of Scientology does. And this is part of their thing. Scientology, what's part of what they do is they go after celebrities. So somebody like John Travolta, Tom Cruise, who I share a birthday with, but he refused to come on the show, even though we share a birthday. They bring this about, and they have this thing that's called the Celebrity Center. And you can see here, this is this hotel that celebrities, some of these really well-known actors, will spend some nights there. And hey, if I'm an actor and I'm wanting to move up, and I know it's about who you know, if I could just run into or have a quick conversation with Tom Cruise at the bar, John Travolta, or some of the directors, wow, that could be it. That could be my big break. So I'm going to go hang out in the Celebrity Center for a while. And that's how they bring you in. I have a friend who is in Hollywood now, and she's told me about stories of a guy that she dated for a while and didn't find out he was a Scientologist till well along in their relationship. She went to what she just thought was some like actors training schools, or little courses, and didn't find out until partway through the program that it was a Scientology thing. They have these coercive ways that they're trying to bring celebrities in, because of course that's marketing. If I can get people to endorse my product that are celebrities, then more people are likely to sign up for what I'm doing. We do that with everything. Why not do it with religion? And especially if you're the guy who wrote The Way to Make $1 Million is to Make Up a Religion. It makes sense that this is part of their culture, part of the way that they go about doing things. So some of the things that they don't want me to tell you, and I didn't want to get hugely into this because it was mainly wanting to present to you guys the basics of what they believe. But one of the first things that's really interesting is looking at things from L. Ron Hubbard's son. So L. Ron Hubbard's son left the organization, and and I'll put links to this again in the description, he has given testimonies of how corrupt and messed up the organization is. So he calls in these testimonies, Scientology is a business. It's not a religion. He called the Sea Org, which is again, their kind of staff, a Nazi SS type of group. He testified that although L. Ron Hubbard said he only got married once, he's been married 3 times. And he said 99% of what Hubbard said about himself was false. Now, we've talked about some of this. We talked about George Washington University, that even though they claimed that he had attended and graduated and all of that in nuclear physics, and then understood the human mind because of that, that wasn't true. He attended for at most 2 semesters, and it could have been into 1 semester if he did 2. And then he was suspended because of academic failure. And we also talked about how his naval career wasn't nearly successful, but also they made the claim that he was shot. There's no record that he ever received a Purple Heart. He wasn't injured at all during the war. And his son testifies to that fact. And then one of the most interesting things is, so a lot of these books that end up being these books that are harder to get your hands on instead of just Dianetics, that end up kind of being almost weirdly like, it seems like you were writing a science fiction and now you're saying that this is like me kind of trying to reveal something to you about the truth of what Dianetics works or whatever. There's one called The History of a Man, and History of Man at one point seems to have a little bit of this weird part that's supposed to help you understand that, like, in some sense you're a clam. And so then if you have problems with chewing It's because you've forgotten your like clam self, and that's why your jaw is not functioning correctly. Well, L. Ron Hubbard's son, in his testimony, talked about this book and said that book came as a result of me just babbling off when I was on a drug trip. That's what it came from. It's totally bullcrap. It's totally made up. And a lot of the religion ends up being founded on this book. So there's that. What's the scariest part in a lot of ways is Mr. David Miscavige. Miscavige ends up taking over. In 1986, L. Ron Hubbard passes away. And Miscavige takes over. Now, what's interesting is, from what we can see, that's not who L. Ron Hubbard actually selected to take over after him. Because what ends up seeming to happen is everyone who's the highest up kind of gets this notification of the two people, so 2 or 3 people that were actually kind of supposed to take over as a group after Hubbard passed, of, hey, these are the successors to Hubbard. And then 1 or 2 days, maybe a week afterwards, everyone gets another official memo. Again, and this is only going out to like the highest up, because they haven't even told everyone really that Hubbard's died. They're trying to figure out, I would assume, how they're going to explain how somebody who's attained clear and is an operating thetan died. And so this is only going out to the higher ups of who's going to be in charge now. But after a couple of days or a week at most, a new memo comes out and it says David Miscavige is now in charge. Now, from everything what we can see, what it seems is Miscavige had some level of blackmail on these other people, and he took power. He was waiting for the moment, and he grabbed it when he could. Miscavige is when everything went horribly wrong. It was one thing to have this weird cult thing going on before Miscavige took over, but after he takes over, things get crazy. So you have now this Sea Org that exists, but those who are in the Sea Org, they're still kind of a ranking level. And if you're ranked well enough, then you might actually have somewhat of an interaction with David Miscavige. But even if you're high up, like his father, Ron, and is even in the same compound out in California that is kind of like, this is where all the higher ups are, doesn't mean you interact with him. So his own father rarely ever saw him while he was still a part of Scientology. Now, his father, Ron, has now left. After Hubbard's death, Miscavige, it seems, like I said, solidified his position as the head chairman of the board of Scientology, and declaring, even though Hubbard's explicitly declared others as his successor. And then there's countless stories of the few people that end up being able to be in a room with him, making plans for what they're going to do, of someone getting out of line. And it's crazy stories of maybe they're going to have some sort of public event at one of their new buildings. Maybe they're opening it up and they want to block the sidewalk across the street. And someone was told by David Miscavige, you're in charge of that. You have to make sure that that is blocked off. And because it's a public street and because it's a public sidewalk, they had no rights to do that. They couldn't block off the street. And he just beat this guy right in the middle of the conference room. And there's stories like this all over about Miscavige, of him doing these sort of things where somebody didn't do what he said and he gets pissed and he just unloads on them. And nobody says a word because that's how much power and terrified they are of him. And sometimes he's not a huge dude. Sometimes it's guys that are even bigger than him. That's where things start to go really crazy. His wife also went missing in 2007, and the investigation seems to have just stopped, and no one's ever heard. No idea where he went or where she went. So the Sea Org, let's talk about that. I probably should put that earlier in my slides because I end up talking about it so much. This is the Sea Org. Ronald Hubbard, being so fascinated with commanding ships, because he could command any ship in any ocean at any time, kind of created this, I would call, again, I think staff is probably the best word for it, staff for Scientology. And they all dress up in naval garb, and a lot of times they're on the ship. In fact, when Hubbard was in charge, he pretty much was on a ship the entire time. Once things really started to take off with Scientology, he was just always gone. He was always on a ship. So the Sea Org ends up being kind of this main group that's part of things. So you can join the Sea Org for just a simple 1 billion year contract. And what's scary about that, during that, you have little to no contact with family, even if your family is part of Scientology, and sometimes even if your family is in the Sea Org too. So contact gets cut off, which is part of the reason why this is viewed as a cult, is when you start cutting people off from their friends, from their family, that's not appropriate. Even, like I said, Miscavige's father did not have interaction with him. Well, they were on the same base. They're like blocks away from each other. He would walk by his own father and ignore him. Now, part of that is because what he claimed is, being a Thetan spirit, he came to realize that actually his father isn't his father. And so he doesn't need to acknowledge him as if he's got any sort of eldership to him or relation to him really at all. And with this, families often don't live together. So I could have joined the Sea Org when I was quite young. And that's part of what's scary about this, is they find oftentimes people end up joining the Sea Org before they're of what we would call age of consent. And they'll just take them. They'll take them from their family, especially if that family, the child, is part of Scientology. But even if I as a child joined the Sea Org, my parents were in the Sea Org, and we even signed up together, chances are we are not going to live together. I won't see my parents, or if I do, the way it's going to work is I will be off at school, they'll be off at work, and then we might see each other at home, or we might actually just, me and my brother will live at one place on the base as kids alone, knowing my parents are on the base with me, not seeing them. And that's how a lot of times it'll function. And there are stories as well of members that become pregnant and then are forced to have an abortion, because that's distracting you from what you're trying to achieve. Part of the, why would you sign up for this? The reason why you would sign up for this is because when you join the Sea Org, you are going to learn how to audit, not be audited, audit, which means if you and I sign up, I can audit you and you can audit me, no cost. So now instead of paying the 20 grand to move up to the next level of the bridge, you and I can just help each other grow up in that ourselves. But when I leave, if you or I leave, then they're going to try to come after you for all the losses that now I supposedly owe to the organization. So this is the crazy thing about how they start making tons of money. So members will often pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for auditing books and other materials. Scientology will look up your accounts to get your credit cards and put it on credit. There are known videos of people being trained to get money from people. Materials are hard and, if not impossible, to find outside of the church. And on average, moving up those bridge levels, it costs 20 grand. So, kids camps. This is, again, one of the scarier things within it. Two that I just wanted to highlight in this is, one is the Delphian school. Tom Cruise wanted to send his daughter, Syria, I think is her name, to this school. But Katie Holmes refused. Good for her. The school cost $42,000 a year. This is the school. Not that impressive. And you can see, even just by the labels here, that starts to get a little questionable. So you have the dorms over here, you have a nice courtyard, you have kitchens, you have a chapel, but an ethics department and an isolation cell. What is going on? This is what's going on. Somebody is going to attend this school, and they're going to use this controversial study tech, which essentially what the study tech is if you don't understand something, they will just repeat the word. Don't understand ontology? I'm just going to say ontology to you until you understand what ontology is. I just have a feeling that probably isn't that effective. So it claims that the misunderstanding is just of anything is a misunderstanding of the root. A misunderstanding of the word is the root of all learning. That's how you need to learn, is you need to understand the words. In these buildings, at the Delphian School, students clean and cook, which is mostly just toast. And as an example, one student that joined, within their first 3 months, they lost 20 pounds. You're paying $42,000 a year, and your students are cooking toast for themselves and cleaning. So essentially what ends up happening is your kid is at this school. There's no one on staff except for a teacher who only is there to teach. They're not there to cook. They're not there to counsel. They're not there to do anything else. They're there to teach and to discipline, and that's it. So it's a meager staff because your kids are doing everything. Yet you're paying $42,000 a year for your kid to go there. Now that sounds nice compared to these work camps. Now the work camps, they will claim, don't exist anymore. These are advertised to kids as a normal camp. You're going to go sledding. You're going to go hiking. You're going to go do all of the fun camp things that I did up at Camp Timberline, a camp up in Estes Park, Colorado, which is freaking awesome. If you look at a camp, check out Camp Timberline. Just a quick plug. So it's advertised as a normal camp. But when you get there, you realize this camp is actually a camp for kids that have broken the rules. It's a discipline camp. And the stories that come out of this, and you can look at more, but I'll just put it simply as this. There are stories of kids that are working 100 hours a week and end up getting $35 for working that much, minus what they then have to pay for their meals, which is usually rice and beans. Rice and beans, 30 cents a meal, $35 a week, and that's it. And you're working 100 hours a week. This isn't right. So, last thing I want to highlight in all of this is what is called fair gaming. So, fair gaming is a policy established by L. Ron Hubbard, and this is even a quote from it. Fair game. Anyone that's called fair game may be deprived of property or injury by any means, by any Scientologist without discipline of the Scientologist. They may be tricked, sued, or lied to, or destroyed. And these are where you get the crazy stories about Scientology. Policy was established in the 1950s, but supposedly was rescinded in 1968. But if you watch Leah Remini's documentary, you can see a lot of those things are still happening, even to them, as they're doing the documentary. Individuals or groups who are fair game are judged to be a threat to the church according to the policy, and can be punished and harassed using any and all means possible. Still today, you have private investigators that will be hired by the church to just bother people who are investigating, whether they've left the church or they are just trying to expose the church. This sort of thing still happens. And oftentimes, one of the ways is just kind of declaring someone who's left the church as what they call a suppressive person. So that is everything that I had on Scientology. If I can get back to my slides or myself here. There's a lot of rabbit holes. There's a lot of things that we probably didn't cover. There's probably a lot of things that you had questions on. I don't know if anybody's watching the stream right now, and that's totally fine. I haven't been doing videos in a while, and so you got to start somewhere. But if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. Maybe I'll figure out some follow-up videos in the future. Thanks for listening in. Hopefully I will be doing more of these in the future. If you like this, please subscribe. Check out these videos in the future as I do more like this, kind of breaking down the basics of world religions. Until then, be heaven to other people.